Hi everyone, and thank you all for joining us today. This is our next webinar for the STFC network and batteries and electrochemical energy devices. I have now just launched a poll, so if you guys could answer those, that would be really helpful for us, the questions in that. Through the presentation, you can write your questions in the Q&A box. This session will be recorded. So today we have a panel again to ask the questions. So we have Rebecca Shutt and Jennifer Hack. They're both PhD students from UCL. And of course, we have our speaker today, Professor Martin Owen Jones. So Professor Jones is Energy Materials and CDT Coordinator for the ICIS Neutron Spallation Facility. He is also a lecturer in organic chemistry for Lincoln College, University of Oxford, and honorary professor of chemistry at St. Andrews University. Professor Jones's scientific interests lie in the synthesis, optimization, and characterization of materials for energy, and in particular the use of X-ray and neutron scattering techniques in operando characterization studies. He has published over 60 papers on many different materials systems, including superconductors, transparent conducting oxides, batteries, chemical energy storage, and catalysis. Thank you, Martin, for agreeing to do this today. And I'll give the floor to you now. So whenever you're ready, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Rema. So I'm going to be talking about characterizing energy materials with neutrons and a tiny little bit about muons as well. Muons is not really my field, but I am contractually obliged to talk about muons whenever I talk about neutrons. So Rema did ask me to do a little bit of a background on how I got to where I am today. So I did my degree and PhD at Nottingham University. My PhD was looking at, well, it started off looking at barrier materials for fast breeder nuclear reactors, and ended up being looking at oxide superconductors. So you can imagine that sort of segue between the two. And then I got a postdoc at Birmingham University looking at superconducting materials, and in particular thin films of superconductors. I did an Erasmus fellowship at the CNRS in Caen with Bernard Revaux looking at nitride oxide superconductors. And then the whole group from Birmingham moved to Oxford University, and I was director of research there, and we looked at nanoparticles and transparent conducting oxides and catalyst materials and hydrogen storage materials. And then I moved to STFC ICIS, and I'm now the Energy Materials Coordinator, which is kind of a grand title for a not so grand job. My job is really to promote and facilitate energy materials research at ICIS, in particular with reference to how we can develop our facilities to aid UK PLC carry out characterization experiments on energy-based materials. And energy materials is basically everything from catalysts through to structural materials for nuclear reactors, and everything in between. So it can be batteries, hydrogen storage, fuel cells, whatever you like. We can argue anything is energy materials if we try hard enough. So what I'm going to be talking about today is some of the facilities and capabilities of ICIS, and then some of the experiments we've carried out over the last 5 years or so, and the developments we've done, with the idea of showing you the sort of things that can be done at ICIS, and hopefully piquing your interest in coming to ICIS to carry out some experiments, let's say in the medium future. The near future, we don't want anyone coming to ICIS, thank you very much. Perhaps November, December, if you're lucky. Certainly 2021, I think we will be back with a more normal operating timeline. But hopefully you can hold off on those experiments until then. If you have a desire to come to ICIS and you don't know who to contact or what you should do, then feel free to just drop me an email. I'm sure Rema will be able to give you my details. I will happily help you do whatever you need to do, or if it's not really in my remit, point you in the right direction of the people you should be speaking to. So having said that, let's talk about ICIS. This is the Rutherford Appleton campus in the south of Oxfordshire, showing the beautiful Oxfordshire weather, and in the background you can see the cooling towers from Didcot Power Station, which are no longer there. In the foreground is ISIS, and in this silver toroid is the diamond light source. We don't talk about them. So this here is the ISIS facility. This green mound here is where we accelerate our protons that we use to generate neutrons. This is Target Station 1 over here, which was opened in around about 1985, and this is Target Station 2, which was opened around about 2005. And the difference between the two is that we learned a lot in 20 years of doing neutron science. So this was built simply to look at length scales around about 1 angstrom. So it's particularly useful if you're interested in the atomic size regime, whereas Target Station 2 was to look at much longer length scales, right out to 400 angstroms and perhaps beyond, to look at much more macroscopic behavior in material systems. And this is the overlay. So over here, we have a linear accelerator. We take H- ions, we put them through an aluminium oxide foil to make protons. The protons are accelerated, and then they're bunched up in the cyclotron here, and then they're fed through into Target Station 1 or Target Station 2, where they will hit what is it? It's tantalum-coated tungsten target, and they will produce neutrons by the spallation process. And what do we study? Well, we study pretty much everything that we can study. So we study the structure and morphology of materials, and that can be either powder diffractometers, liquid diffractometers, small angle scattering, reflectometry, and imaging and tomography. We look at the dynamics or the spectroscopy of molecules by neutron spectroscopy and muon spectroscopies. And then we have a host of other laboratories on site that allow us to do all the sorts of chemistry and physics, biology and material science that you would do perhaps in your own lab, but you'll need to do near to or on a beamline. So we have capabilities to help you whenever you come and do an experiment. And we have something like 31 neutron and muon instruments. The number is always increasing. We're always putting on new facility. We are currently awaiting a long shutdown of approximately a year, where we will upgrade all of the instrumentation in Target Station 1 to increase the neutron flux in these instruments. But our instruments are molecular spectroscopy instruments, which are colored in red. We have diffraction instruments, which are generally colored in blue, and we have small angle scattering in orange, and reflectometry in Target Station 2 over here in orange as well. Okay, so I've explained how we make our neutrons. This is a pretty nice schematic showing the difference between Target Station 1 and Target Station 2. So what we do is we accelerate this proton beam and we fire it into this target 50 times a second. And 80% of the protons come to Target Station 1 and 20% of the protons go to Target Station 2. And despite the fact that this has a much higher proton flux, the neutron flux in Target Station 2 is better than in Target Station 1, simply because of the knowledge gained in 20 years of operating Target Station 1, mean that we've designed Target Station 2 to be much, much more efficient and capture many more of the neutrons that are produced in this process. And we don't carry out any single experiment. We carry out a whole host of different experiments across a wide range of scientific areas. So if you think about the early days of ISIS in the 80s, in the early days of neutron scattering in the UK, most of the experiments would look at things like hard materials. We looked at quantum fluids and superconducting materials and the structure of oxides, and looked at magnetic properties. And as our facility and our understanding and our ability to carry out experiments has developed, we've moved through that into things like superconductors and buckyballs and catalysts, and then into soft materials, thin films, small materials, and then even now into the pharmacology and the biotechnology areas. And we carry out and have carried out experiments in all of these different areas. In terms of energy materials, then we cover an enormous size range as well. So we can do experiments that thinks about atomic understanding. We look at the atoms within solids or liquids or polymers or disordered materials and how they behave one to another. We can look at macromolecules, such this is a hydrogenase catalyst, biological catalyst. We can look at things like photovoltaics and PN junctions, where we're talking about micron type resolution. We can look at fuel cells when perhaps you're talking about tenths of centimeters, lithium batteries when you're talking about millimeter resolution, and even all the way up to 1 meter resolution when you're thinking about a reheater tube of failure. This is actually an actual experiment that was carried out to look at these reheater tubes that are used as part of the cooling cycle in nuclear reactors. And we analysed these and we determined how long they could last. And we said, no, you can keep on using them for a few years. And the value of that particular experiment was about £1 billion to the nuclear industry, because it meant that they could extend the lifetime of their existing reheater tubes and not have to think about replacing them. And so we carry out experiments on all these length scales. And of course, through all of these different types of energy materials systems, anything you can imagine that might be an energy material, then we certainly will have done an experiment on it at some time at ISIS. So why do we use neutrons? Well, neutrons are highly penetrating, which means they can see through things very easily. They are non-destructive, so you will not damage your material in any way with a neutron, and they can be used to study samples in extreme environments. And the reason they can do that is because we can encase our sample of interest in a complex sample environment that can be made out of high tensile steel. We can heat it up to very high temperatures and very high pressures. And if we do the experiment properly, all we'll see in our neutron experiment is actually our sample of interest. So a particular way that that works is you see this rock, this siliceous piece of material in it. You can see inside there's this green leaf. If you do a neutron experiment, this is actually neutron tomography imaging of a rock. You see the organic matter very clearly because it contains carbon and hydrogen, which scatters neutrons very strongly. Whereas the siliceous material, the rock material outside it, doesn't scatter neutrons so strongly, and therefore you can see the plant material, which is actually a fossil, within the rock without having to crack the rock open. And compared to X-rays, of course, this is a very famous picture here on the left-hand side. This is Röntgen's wife's hand. You can imagine how that conversation went. Oh, hello, darling. I've just invented a new way of looking at things. Do you mind putting your hand in this X-ray beam for me? You can see the bones, and you can see her jewelry very, very clearly, because X-rays scatter proportional to the square of the number of electrons around the nucleus, whereas neutrons interact with the nucleus, and therefore the scattering doesn't depend upon the atomic number. And so the way to compare the two techniques is that X-rays are very much like, well, an X-ray, whereas neutrons are very much like an MRI scanner. And so you will see the soft tissue. So if you look at the scattering here, so the red is the scattering by X-rays and the blue is the scattering by neutrons, we get very strong scattering from light elements like hydrogen, lesser extent lithium, carbon and oxygen, which you don't get for X-rays. So X-rays, the scattering is dependent on the atomic number. And also we get differential scattering from elements that are close to each other, which is particularly important for transition metals. So we can differentiate, for example, between nickel and copper by neutron scattering, which is very difficult by X-ray scattering. Also, we can play funny games with isotopes. So deuterium has a very low scattering, whereas hydrogen has a very high scattering. But the types of scattering between these two are different. So hydrogen has an incoherent scatter, which means it loses a lot of energy, whereas deuterium has a coherent scatter. So if we want to do a crystallographic experiment where we're interested in the coherent scatter from the materials, the Bragg peaks, we can replace the hydrogen in our material with deuterium, and we'll get a strong signal for that. If we want to do a spectroscopy measurement where we're interested in the energy loss from the neutron after it's interacted with our material, then we keep the hydrogen in there, and the hydrogen has a very good incoherent scatter and shows up very strongly. And so we do different experiments with different isotopes and to get different sets of information depending upon the nature of the experiment that we're performing. Now it says down here chemistry remains the same when you switch between deuterium and hydrogen. That's not necessarily true. Definitely deuterium weighs much more than hydrogen, and so there is a difference in kinetics depending on the processes you're looking at. But generally speaking, it's very, very similar. The other thing we can do with isotopes is if you had, for example, a complex membrane that was made up of 2 or more components, if you hydrogenated one part of that membrane and you had the other part deuterated, and then you took coherent neutron scatter from that, you would only see, or significantly see, the one with the deuterium on, and the one with the hydrogen on would be invisible. And if then reverse that process so that the other part was hydrogenated and the first part was deuterated, you would see the first part. And so for all the constituents of your membrane or complex material, you can actually look at individually within the system without having to pull it apart. And then you can go back and you can put it all together. And that allows us to interrogate individual parts of complex systems. Neutrons, of course, also have a magnetic moment and spin, which means they can be used to interrogate magnetic materials and spin materials, so particularly important for things like hard disk drives and the potential of spintronic electronics in the future. And muons. So a slight aside, we make positive muons, and these are fundamental particles with charge, and they behave like large versions of their equivalent fundamental particle. And what we do is you put a neutron through a carbon beam and you make a positive muon, and the muon will embed within a material, and it will behave much like the material that its position it's occupying. So you make this positively charged muon into a lithium battery material, and it behaves much like the lithium that you're interested in motion. And after a while, that muon will decay and it will produce a positron, and that positron is then detected by our detectors. And the way that that muon decays is dependent entirely on its local environment. And so for understanding how those positrons are produced from that muon decay, you can understand the local environment within your material, and so you can study how the local environment changes depending upon what you're doing to it, whether you change the composition or you're putting an electric field on it or what have you. So you have another non-destructive probe for investigating materials, and this is becoming particularly important for battery type materials. So diffraction is probably the earliest form of neutron science, and we do a lot of diffraction. We have a lot of diffraction instrumentation. You can see in this picture here, we have a very tiny sample. This is actually a millimeter cube sample. I haven't created a giant needle and put a rope through it to pretend that it's a needle with cotton thread. This actually is a needle with cotton thread. And we can generate very, very good diffraction patterns now from samples this small. This, in fact, is the diffraction pattern from that sample. It's prepared at high temperature and high pressure, and therefore the sample size is very small. 10 years ago, we would not have been able to collect data so good on a sample this small, but nowadays we can do diffraction on even tiny samples like this. We can do diffraction experiments at extremes of temperature and pressure. This is an example of looking at steel melting up to 1700 degrees C dynamically in a beamline. And so you can see these are the Bragg peaks here, and they're shifting because, of course, we're increasing the temperature. First of all, we're heating and then we're cooling. And this is the D-spacing in angstrom, so much like you'd see for an X-ray diffraction pattern. And you see these discontinuities in these data. These are due to shifts in the structure type. So you got the alpha prime going to the alpha for steel. And here in the middle, the Bragg peaks seem to disappear, and that's because we're getting melting of the steel. And then when we cool it down, we get these Bragg peaks reappearing, and again, we get this phase transformation of the alpha to alpha prime. And so we can do extremes of temperature, extremes of pressure, and complex and dangerous and toxic gas environments as well, if that's what you need to do. We can do things on the local structure and on the average structure as well. So the previous experiment, this is looking at the average structure, is looking at all of the diffraction from all of the sample in one go. We can do something called a pair distribution function, where we analyze the local structure around each of the atoms within the material. And if you look at this, these are looking at essentially the thermal motion of these atoms of this material. And you can see the motion of the bismuth atom is very symmetric, whereas that titanium is spread out across the X, and the iron and the magnesium are spread out across the Y. And these local deviations in the properties of these cations are what give this material its piezoelectric properties. So this anisotropic displacement of these atoms allow you to understand the origin of the functional properties of this material through a very high resolution power diffraction experiment. And we do studies like this quite a lot as well. We also do magnetic diffraction. If we just look at the graph on the left-hand side, here we have a compound where the dopant is 0, and as we cool it down, we see this peak resolves itself into 2 peaks. And this is an orthorhombic distortion, splitting this line into two lines from a tetragonal to orthorhombic, because we're starting to create a magnetic structure within the material, which changes the space grip of the material. On the other side, we've got a constant temperature. Now we're changing the value of X, and we see the same thing. As X increases, we go from this orthorhombic structure back into the tetragonal as we eliminate the magnetic properties of the material through doping. And so we can study and correlate the changes in magnetic properties with either changes in temperature or changes in pressure or composition of materials. And the other part of diffraction that we do is we do what we might call engineering diffraction, which is we look at macroscopic things and we look at the surface diffraction of these materials. What you can see in this picture here is actually part of the Airbus A380 wing, and we are going to do diffraction on the welds in that wing to determine if there's any local or residual stress produced by the welding process. And we can put the whole wing into the beamline. There's a three-dimensional laser array that maps that wing, and then there's a repositioning robot will then orient it into the beam and allow you to look at whichever part you want to look at, and also it will remember which part is where and how it's been moved. And we can do this on wings, we can do it on railway lines, we can do it on our jet engines, and we can investigate a whole host of things like how does tensile stress influence the diffraction properties in the surface stresses and strains, which are very important for failure of welds, but also for corrosion processes and many other industrial things where things are actually being used, and how does the actual use influence that surface diffraction. Okay, so an example of some of the diffraction studies that we've done, this is one that we did with Toyota quite a few years ago now, and Toyota originally wanted to put their hydrogen for their hydrogen-powered cars into tanks that contain transition metal alloys. And the reason they wanted to do that is because there's a volume saving on the tank size. But what they found was they had this proprietary titanium, chromium, manganese hydrogen alloy, and when they put their hydrogen in, they only got about half of the hydrogen back out, and they wanted to know why that hydrogen wasn't coming out. And so we did a neutron diffraction experiment on this, and we put their alloy in the beam, and what we saw was absolutely nothing. And the reason we saw absolutely nothing was the combination of titanium, chromium, and manganese alloy that they had for their hydrogen storage material actually had a 0 neutron scattering, which meant that when we put the hydrogen in, all we saw was the position of the hydrogen. So we loaded it up with hydrogen, and then we desorbed the hydrogen, and we saw which hydrogen was sequestered within the metal structure. Then we took it across the diamond, and diamond couldn't see the hydrogen, of course, but they did allow us to see all the metal atoms. And we worked out that you could get these channels, and if the hydrogen went in these channels, then it was free to move. But if they went in these sort of square planar ellipsoid sites, then it was fixed and immobile. And we were able to solve that problem through a combination of neutron and X-ray diffraction. This is a piece of work we did in conjunction with quite a few people, actually David Scanlon and David Payne and others. And they were very interested in understanding how car batteries worked. No one really cared about that for hundreds of years, but all of a sudden it became quite a hot topic. And they worked out that conductivity in lead oxide could be produced simply by creating oxygen vacancies. And their theoretical studies showed that, if you had this number of vacancies, then you would have this certain amount of current. But they wanted to count the number of oxygens present in the material and see if it correlated with their theoretical measure that they've derived from the measured conductivity of these samples. So they gave us samples of lead oxide. Now, of course, because we're not dependent on atomic number, our scattering from oxygen is just as good as our scattering from lead. And so we were able to see very closely and very precisely the amount of oxygen within the PBO, or PBO1 minus X. And we calculated 1.6% vacancy from the observed Bragg data, and that correlated extremely well with their calculations. And so we were able to show that their calculations were actually correct, and these materials were non-stoichiometric to the level that they indeed had predicted. Rema, when did we say we'll take a break? Is it now or is it after this bit? You're still on mute though.
I think after this bit. So
okay, cool, right. So neutron spectroscopy is essentially an energy loss process. So what we're looking at is we have inelastic scattering with atoms now, with nuclei, and we look at the energy that the neutrons lose in that inelastic scattering. And what it allows us to do is it allows us to think about the motion of atoms within a solid or a liquid, or even on occasions a gas. And in terms of how you might consider a neutron spectroscopy, it's very, very similar to IR and Raman spectroscopy, apart from one very significant difference. And that one significant difference is because it's a momentum transfer process, there are no selection rules associated with the spectroscopy, which means we're not limited by the point group or space group of the material that we're looking at. We will get all of the vibrational modes will be activated by the momentum transfer. And that allows you to look at some very interesting things. So this is a Tosca spectra of hydrogenated nanoscale graphite, increasing the amount of hydrogen on it through treatment of that material. And we get to see, you know, in the red one, this is hydrogen on ZrO2. The blue one is hydrogen on ZrO2 that's been exposed for 80 hours. And the black one is ball milled and then exposed for 80 hours. And so these peaks that appear here in the inelastic spectra correspond to hydrogen bound to the surface of carbon nanoparticles. And the energy of these peaks is a feature of the nature of that binding, whether you're forming hydrogen bonds to graphitic hydrogen or aliphatic hydrogen, or graphitic carbon or aliphatic carbon. And you can then look at the evolution of these hydrogen forming reactions. And why is that important? Well, this is very important for things like catalysts. If you think about water gas shift reaction, where you're making carbon monoxide and hydrogen, you get a lot of carbon deposition on your catalyst. And if that deposition is graphitic, then that catalyst becomes deactivated very rapidly, whereas if it's aliphatic, you can actually burn it off and hydrogenate it off and regenerate your catalyst. So we're actually looking at catalytic materials by spectroscopy. It gives you a very deep understanding of the processes and the mechanisms of those catalysts, for example. This is some work that Nottingham University did looking at their NOT 300 MOF material, which is the world's best MOF for capturing SO2 and CO2. And they did some inelastic spectra looking at the motion of the SO2 and CO2 molecules within the cages of this MOF material. And what you have to do when you have an experiment like this is you have to have a virtuous circle. So you make your material at Nottingham and then you take it to Diamond and you do X-ray diffraction, and that gives you the structure of your framework. And then you do neutron powder diffraction, and that gives you the position of the hydrogen atoms within that framework. And then you do inelastic neutron scattering, and that gives you the nature of the gas-bound species and how they're interacting with that host. And then you put that into DFT modeling, and you use that DFT modeling to influence the synthesis of new and improved materials. And you can model very, very precisely how these gas molecules align. And if you have a good understanding of the structure, you can understand why they've done that aligning as well. Okay, let me have a pause.
Yeah, we'll have a pause for a few questions now. So thanks, Martin. I think, so we have a question from Yang Zhu. He says, could you please talk about how ISIS operates? I guess you did that. And maybe give us some tips on how to write a successful application for beam time.
I've got a whole lecture on how to write a successful proposal. Maybe we can do that another time. I mean, I'd happy to give that as well, because there are a lot of tips. So the way that ISIS operates is we have a call for proposals twice a year. And normally we are oversubscribed by about 200%. Those call for proposals then go to a panel meeting. A panel is comprised of a number of external scientists who will each read all the proposals, and then we'll put them in a ranking order. And then days available on the instruments will be allocated to those proposals until we run out of days. Now, in terms of tips for writing a proposal, the most important one is to talk to instrument scientists before you write a proposal. So instrument scientists will tell you what is and what isn't possible on the individual instruments that you want to work on. If you don't know what instrument you want to work on, then you should talk to me and I'll tell you. After that, you need to really be sure that neutrons are what you need to solve your particular question. So I always tell everybody that neutron experiments are the last experiment you ever want to do, because they should be the last experiment you ever do. Because if you can do it another way, almost certainly that other way is going to be easier than using neutrons to do it. So don't ever try and do a neutron experiment that will mimic an NMR. You should just do an NMR. But if you need neutrons, if you need to see hydrogen atoms, for example, by diffraction, if you have complex sample environment that you need to put into a beam and look at the change in structure while you're heating the bejeebus out of it, then yes, we can do those experiments for you. And that's exactly what we would be delighted to help you.
Great. So we also have a question from Stephen Skinner. Could you manage to undertake an in situ monolysis experiment on a diffractometer? I think as an example, an oxide sample at high temperature under ammonia flow.
Hi, Stephen. Yeah, we've done that. We had to build sample environment to do it. But yes, we've done high temperature. I mean, it depends how high you want to go. 600 is not a problem. 1000 we can discuss for certain. There are certain issues with steel at 1000 degrees C that perhaps ammonia might exacerbate. But yeah, we can certainly do those sorts of experiments. We have done, not with oxides, but we've done with amides and imides, looking at ammonia cracking in a beam in the temperature regime of about 400 to 600. But if you wanted to go hotter, then I don't think that would be too much of a problem.
Great, thanks. And we have another question from John Varco. So can neutron spectroscopy be used to study crystallization in polymers?
Hi, John. All right. The problem with that is the time regime. So if your crystallographic processes are slow and they happen at about 30 Kelvin, then yes. So the problem with the neutron spectroscopy is that because we're looking at the motion of the atoms, then the thermal motion of those atoms washes out the signal that we're looking for. So most of our experimentation is done round about base temperature of 30 Kelvin. It's not impossible to do it at a higher temperature. It's just very difficult. I think if you wanted to look at crystallization of polymers and you really are talking about forming a crystalline structure, then you could do it by diffraction. Otherwise, I think perhaps PDF might be the way to go.
Well, thank you. Yeah, we'll have one more question before we move on. So it's Yang Yu. Could you also please talk a bit about the capability of neutron characterization of atomic defects in materials, such as defects, locations, concentrations, etc.?
Okay, so that's really not a strong point for me. I've never done any experiments looking at defects, but given that given the resolution power of diffraction experimentation, we can get information on the quantity of defects if you're talking about non-stoichiometry within solids. If you're talking about things that perhaps you would look at most commonly by high-resolution electron microscopy, such as slip defects or Frenkel defects and things like that, that is much harder for us to do with diffraction techniques. There have been some studies where things like that have been done, but it is a very niche type of experiment to do. You have to have a really good reason to want to try and do that by diffraction rather than by electron microscopy, I think.
Cool. Thank you, Martin. I think we'll leave the rest of the questions for the end of the.
Okay. So one of our rapidly developing areas is imaging with neutrons. And the new IMAT facility that we have allows us to look at and create images of materials in a sort of tens of micron resolution range. And not only will that give you a tomography image, like a three-dimensional photograph of your material, you can also extract information on the texture. So look at the Bragg edges, which will tell you how the atoms are arranged within the structure, and look at the Bragg resonance peaks, which tells you which atoms or isotopes are present. So you can have a pixel that might perhaps be 3 or 4 microns by 3 or 4 microns. And within that pixel, you'll be able to tell which elements are present and what is the surface roughness and what is the texture of that pixel. And that means you can create three-dimensional images of things like, this is a diesel engine, this is the inside of a Buddha, this is a piece of geology and paleontology. I'm well aware that none of these are energy materials. This one, however, is an energy material. So this was actually sent to me by Winfried, who runs the IMAT facility, which is a piece of work carried out by Ralph, who, interesting enough, is actually at UCL. So I'm sure some of you know Ralph. And even more interestingly, or perhaps less interestingly, I will be his external examiner for his Viva in August. But this is actually a three-dimensional tomography image of a commercially available lithium battery. And so 53 tomography images were taken of this battery. And here you can see a three-dimensional reconstruction of the inside of the battery. And here you can see slices through that battery at different stages of charging and discharging. So here it is fully charged, here it is half charged, and here it is fully discharged. And what you can see is you can see the diffusion of the lithium metal as you go from the fully charged to the discharged. And you can see the creation of these white patches, which are SO2 gases that build up within the battery, which may degrade the performance of the battery over its lifetime. But the tomography gives you all of this information. Admittedly, this is a 3-day experiment to collect all of these images, but it gives you all of the internal information of this battery dynamically in operando without having to cut it open. We can also look at disordered material. Normally people might think of disordered materials as glasses. Here we have something called MCM41, which is a mesoporous material. And we've got 3 sets of data here. We have this solid black line, which is this lowest line, which is the dry material. And then we have this dotted line here, which is the middle line, which is partially loaded with nitrogen. You start to see the appearance of these peaks at different energies. And then finally, we have the fully loaded material, which is the top line here, when it's fully loaded with nitrogen. Now, this was a dynamic experiment. It was done on 0.5 gram of material at 90 Kelvin. The before data took 90 minutes to collect. During nitrogen loading, data sets were collected every 6 minutes, and then the final data set was 30 minutes. And what this gives you, you do a Fourier transform of this information, and you get this pair distribution function information. So you get the nitrogen-nitrogen distance of the nitrogen gas that's physisorbed to the surface of the mesopore. You get the silicon-oxygen distance and the oxygen-oxygen distance. And what you can see is that the nitrogen-nitrogen distance, the intensity of this peak increases as we load with nitrogen, as you would expect. And there's some change in the silicon-oxygen distance, is mostly relative to the total scattering within the system, but no real change in the position of this peak, which means that the material is not bowing or buckling under nitrogen loading. So we're not actually causing it to swell or change in volume. But what we see out here, we see changes in these peaks which correspond to the void space within that mesopore. And from these lines, we can see, as these lines increase in intensity, we can see that these pores become progressively more filled, and we can use this information to calculate the amount of filling within the mesopore. And we can do all of this experimentation within a single experiment, and we can do it dynamically on a minute time scale as well. So we see the atomic interactions and the mesostructure out to about 400 angstroms, if there is information out to that range as well, dynamically as well. QENS is quasi-elastic neutron scattering. It's very like inelastic neutron scattering, except all we're looking for is the scattering that's very close to the pure elastic line. So essentially what we're looking at is the broadening of the elastic line, and that broadening is caused by motion of species within the solid. And you can use, I'm going to talk a little bit about QENS a bit later, but you can use QENS to look at material science. So we've used it to look at hydrogen motion or ionic motion through solids. It can be used to look at soft matter, It can be biological systems and of course chemical systems like ionic liquids, clays and porous material. And it's very useful if you've got any sort of species that's mobile, and that species can be an ion, it can be a gas molecule, it can be a liquid molecule, as long as it's mobile. And QENs can actually operate up to several hundreds, up to 800 degrees centigrade as well. So if you've got high temperature fuel cells, for example, and you want to look at the motion of your species through those fuel cells, you can do that on a QENs experiment. We also do small angle scattering. So small angle scattering sits pretty much in between diffraction studies and microscopy studies, and it'll give you information about these agglomerates, about these complex materials, whether they be proteins or complex nanoparticles or micelles, polymers, nanotubes. And essentially the information from that, from the real space density distribution of your material, influences the shape of its response to the energy of the neutron. And so that shape determines whether it be a Gaussian coil or a sphere, a disk or a rod. And it can give you a lot of information about how your materials agglomerate and how they behave relative to each other within a non-crystalline system. And also we do reflectometry. So a lot of new instruments have been built to study reflectometry. Reflectometry is essentially a measure of the refractive index of a material to the neutron. So everyone knows that the school experiment where you're looking into the water and the position of the fish is actually different to the way you think the fish is, because the refractive index of water is different to the refractive index of light. So the light comes down like that and goes down like that. And so the fish is actually here and not there, or there and not here. And this is doing the same thing. We're measuring the refractive index of a material. So as the neutron goes through the material, that refractive index changes, and that changes how long it takes to go through that material. And that results in these bumps in this graph, looking at the intensity against the energy range of the neutrons. And what can you use that to do? Well, lots of things. We've looked at, well, not we, but Bill David and colleagues have looked at it to look at hydrogen absorption in a titanium magnesium multi-layer system. And what they found was, if you had titanium magnesium multi-layers, you put hydrogen on, the hydrogen would initially go into the titanium layer below the magnesium before it went into the magnesium layer, which was sitting on top of the titanium. And if you made multi-layers of this, the titanium would always be hydrogenated preferentially to the magnesium. And you can see that by the difference in the refractive index that comes from the reflectometry. Of course, reflectometry is also very important for things like hard disk drives, magnetic storage media, any sort of tribology or surface layers that you're interested into. A bit about muons. So I told you, oh no, do I not? I'm not muons. In-situ characterization, excuse me, I was confused by my own title. So in-situ characterization is the area that I say I would worked on the most at ISIS. One of the first pieces of apparatus that we built was this. It was called the Intelligent Gravimetric Analyzer for Neutrons. And essentially, it's a thermogravimetric analyzer that we can crane out and we can crane into a beam and allow us to look at gas uptake and gas desorption in the beam at various temperatures and various pressures. And this is a sample Bragg image from lithium nitride being hydrogenated to lithium amide and lithium imide. The big gap in the middle is where the beam went off. This is one of the hazards of doing a neutron experiment, especially if it's a neutron experiment where you can't stop. So these sort of thermodynamically favorable processes, once the hydrogen gas goes on, it will continue. And so you just have to collect data. But you can clearly see you've got a phase transformation as the lithium nitride disappears, lithium deuteride and lithium imide is formed, and that will eventually go on to form lithium amide, which is just coming in here. And you can use that Bragg information, you can plot the phase transformation of these phases. You can see the lithium nitride phase is decreasing and the other three phases are increasing in intensity, and you can plot that and you can calculate the kinetics of those processes. This is just an Avrami fit that Bill David did. But also you can look at the dynamics as well. So you can think about what happens to the cycling of this process. And here we've applied the same pressure over the same time scale at the same temperature, and we've got the same behavior each case. We've gone to lithium amide in both cases, and then when we remove the pressure, it goes to lithium imide, and all these reach the same sort of level. So it's a very repeatable process. We can also try and vary the pressure. So if we use a different pressure regime, we can see how the weight changes on each hydrogenation cycle. And see, as we increase the pressure, unremarkably, then the weight increases, indicating that we've increased the amount of amide formed on each pressurization step. But we can also follow that in the Bragg information, and you see this wiggle here in this line. This is not from any sort of movement of the sample. This is actually from it going to amide to imide to amide to imide as we put hydrogen on, take hydrogen off, or deuterium in this case, put hydrogen on, take hydrogen off. And this shifting corresponds to that weight gain and weight loss. And if you look very carefully over at the lithium deuteride line over here, you should be able to see the intensity, which is given by the amount of red in this line, increases, then decreases, increases and decreases, depending on how much gas we're putting onto the system. And we can follow all of that dynamically in a single experiment. Now, we've done it with lithium amide and lithium imide because it's the system we're working on at the time, but it can be done with any sort of system where you have this reversible gas absorption, gas desorption process. Another thing we've developed is looking at a microwave resonator for looking at the dielectric properties of materials. I won't go into too much detail about why we've done that. What it does allow you to do is this is the structure here of our material, and this is the dielectric response. And as we've put SO2, this is the same material that I talked about earlier about the SO2 absorbing moth from Manchester. As we put SO2 onto the sample, you see this crystallographic change, and this corresponds to a big change in the frequency of the dielectric properties. And that means we can use this simple dielectric resonator as a way of measuring the amount of SO2 that's been sequestered within our gas filter. So if you imagine if you're building a carbon dioxide or an SO2 filter to put on a gas stream, say from a power station or industrial process, you might want to know when that filter is filled. You probably don't have the ability to take a sample of that and take it to a neutron beam line every time you want to know if it's full, but you do have the ability to take a dielectric measurement. A sort of resonator here might cost a few pence to build and measure, and so it becomes a very good method for diagnosing materials. Of course, we use this Bragg information to look at the structure and the location of the SO2 molecules within the sites. And we can see that the different sites are populated depending on the chemical potential to bind SO2, of course. And we can correlate that with the dielectric properties as well. So the dielectric properties change depending on which sites are filled. And we can actually get this isotherm. So this is the linear low SO2 part of the isotherm, and the black crosses correspond to the microwave dielectric measurements, and the red triangles correspond to isotherms measured through a normal standard method. And we see the correlation is almost perfect between the microwave properties and the SO2 absorption measured by isotherm. And so we have a very, very good measure of SO2 absorption in our materials, and we need to do the combination of neutron diffraction and microwave resonance to get this full characterization of the system and get all the information that we can from that. And we do that, and again, in a single experiment dynamically under flow. This is a piece of kit that we built with St Andrews University to look at the conductivity of hydrogen in barium hydride, which is the potential material for a solid oxide fuel cell. And essentially we could put a neutron beam onto this green disk here, and when we change the gaseous environment around it, we can see how that influences the conductivity, because this probe also measures the conductivity at that disk at the same time. So changing the chemical environment, measuring the conductivity, and also measuring the structure. So this is what the kit looks like when you actually build it. We have a thin section here to minimize the amount of quartz that sits in front of our sample. We have a simple 4-point probe connected to the surface of the pellet to measure the impedance. And what we see is we go from hydrogen to deuterium. See the pellet resistance decreases. Pellet resistance decreases and then increases as we go as we remove the hydrogen and then increase the hydrogen. And this property is related to the fundamental difference between hydrogen and deuterium and its propagation through the material, because the deuterium is twice the weight of the hydrogen. And only through this structural characterization and impedance characterization can we understand these correlations between macroscopic behavior and the microscopic crystalline structure. We can also take that same probe and put it on QENS, and this is some work also done with St Andrews and John Irving and Gavin Irving up at St Andrews. And we've used combined neutron diffraction and QENS to determine the disorder in these hydrogen sites here in the same sort of material, barium hydride. And we can see that there's a lot of disorder in these hydrogen sites, and that this disorder that mediates the ionic motion through the solid. So use of QUENS allows us to identify the hopping distance and the hopping mechanism of these hydrogen ions, and we can see they go from D1 to D1, and that correlates extremely well with the high resolution diffraction and PDF experiments looking at the local and average structure of these barium hydride materials. And it's only through combination of these really three techniques that we get a full understanding of this system. This is work very shortly to be published, so don't go stealing it. And of course we study batteries. Now batteries are quite a tricky thing to study because you need to maintain the electrochemical purpose of the battery material itself. There's no point in building a battery cell that is not electrochemically interesting. And you also need to maximize the amount of electrode material that you put in the beam, because we need quite a lot of material in the neutron beam to get decent neutron data. And so Steve Hull and colleagues at Uppsala have built this cell, which is essentially a coiled battery. And this is then put into a bar like this, and then the neutron beam will look at this part. And there you're looking at a lot of electrode surfaces at once. And then if you do a charging, discharging experiment, you can see the changes in the crystallography of that material. And then finally, we have one other type of cell that we've built. And this one, we have current collectors, and you deposit your material on top of this vanadium, current collector on this vanadium screen, and then you arrange it so you're only looking at one of the electrode surfaces at one time. And you can collect, this is what it looks like, and you collect Bragg information on that material as you go through the charging and discharging process, and you can see the phase changes and the relative proportion of those phases on that charging and discharging cycle. There are many other different types of sample environment, of course, and if we don't have the appropriate type of sample environment for your experiment, then we will very happily talk with you about building it. So I've gone on far too long as it is already, so I'll say thank you very much for the invite, and that is the end of my whistle-stop tour of characterization of energy materials.
Thank you so much, Martin. That was really enjoyable. I think, yeah, we have time maybe for a few questions. So a question that asks about the high pressure measurements. What is the highest pressure that could be measured?
So we can put Paris Edinburgh cells onto the beamline, but then you're talking about very tiny amounts of sample, but then that's a sort of gigapascal regime. We quite happily operate at hundreds of bar. I mean, there are mechanisms for doing hundreds of bar. So intermediate range in the kilobar, I think, is a little bit difficult for us.
Cool. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I think you touched on this just before the end, but Zori Akbari was asking about using neutron diffraction to detect phase evolution during battery operation.
Yeah, so we definitely can do that. So I mean, it depends on what battery systems you're looking at, and we will probably have to design a specific experiment for each different type of battery to maximize the amount of material that goes in the beam. But yes, crystallographic phase evolution we can do certainly very straightforwardly. If it's non-crystallographic, that poses a bit more of a problem, but it's not the end of the world. I'm sure we could work on something that will allow us to do that too.
If I unmute myself. So the next question is, how do you maintain the liquid electrolytes during in situ battery characterizations?
So for this particular cell, as you can see, we have pipe work to maintain the electrolyte, so we can actually pump out the electrolyte and pump it back in again, actually in situ in this experiment. So as long as these links here are gas tight, then we can easily change the electrolyte material.
I wonder, as a follow-up to that, does the beam affect the structure of the electrolyte at all?
It shouldn't do. So our interaction with solids is particularly weak, and we are very low energy, especially when compared to X-rays. So we are very good at looking at battery materials, electrodes or electrolytes that suffer from beam damage under X-ray sources. So if your material is damaged even on a laboratory X-ray, it's very unlikely to be damaged by neutrons.
What if it was like a nuclear material? Just
that's fine as well, as long as we stay below criticality, we're good. So we have done experiments on uranium and plutonium. In the past, that has posed a bit of a problem, but now we've got people who understand that we're not going to create a bomb, and that bombarding uranium with neutrons doesn't necessarily end up in a critical mass.
Yeah, I think I've got, maybe I'd ask like, okay, you said that there's going to be a year of closure. Is that going to be delayed because of COVID, or?
Unfortunately, that decision has not been made. So I can't tell you whether that is or isn't going to be delayed or not. I can't even tell you which way is more likely than the other. I mean, the powers that be are really waiting to decide after we've started operations again. And then if operations are successful, then that decision will be made.
Cool. I don't know, are there any more questions maybe? I don't know, Becky or Jen or just
yeah, I had a question. I was just wondering, so there's like quite a few neutron sources around the world, and I wondered if, like, do they have specialisms, and does ISIS have a specialism that it's like kind of well renowned for?
There are a few around the world. Yes, there are fewer than there were, and there will be fewer than there are in the future. In terms of specialisms, yes. How technical would you like me to go? So the ISIS generally has a short neutron pulse length, which is better for diffraction, whereas the new spallation source that's being built in Lund in Sweden will have a longer pulse length, which will be better for spectroscopy experiments. There's a very high-powered source in America, an SNS in Tennessee, that is pretty similar to the way that we work. And then there are nuclear facilities such as the ILL in Grenoble, which have a constant wavelength and are better for other applications. Also, the one in Switzerland, the Swiss light source, is next to the Swiss light source, is very good for doing things like tomography and imaging. And so, yes, there are specializations for different experimentation, but it doesn't. It depends what you want to do, really. It depends on how critical certain parts of your characterization experiment are. For general experiments, it doesn't really matter too much. If you're doing extremely high resolution diffraction, then yes, you probably want a shorter pulse length and a longer pulse length. If you're doing tomography experiments, perhaps you want to go for a nuclear source rather than the pulse source. But you can do all of these experiments at all of these facilities.
Jen, I think you're muted.
Yep, so there's just a question that's just come through. How well does neutron diffraction help in investigating long-range orders in materials?
So the second target station was designed specifically to do that. So WISH will give you a diffraction range of around about at least 100 angstroms and probably 200, 300 and more angstroms. So if you're looking at long-range effects in WISH, then you should see everything that's of interest. I mean, originally designed to look at magnetic and superconducting materials, but actually it's used a lot by the mesoporous community as well, simply because they have interactions out of that sort of length range. So yes, you can do all those sorts of studies for sure.
Okay, thank you. Maybe I don't know, one last question and then I'll finish. So Stephen Skinner is asking, what's the spatial resolution of the IMAT facility? What
tens of microns, Stephen, I'd say, tens of microns.
Cool. All right, thank you. Thank you so much, Martin, for your talk, and thank you all for attending. We've got an announcement, so I think we're going to launch the this year's round of awards, and this year we're not going to have any early career travel awards because of the current situation. But that means that we'll have more money to spend on experimental design awards. So I will send you an email about that. Yeah, I look forward to all the applications. Yeah, again, thank you so much, Martin. And
thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, and thank you, Jen and Becky. And I hope everyone had you know, a nice time. I think yes, I'll close the thing now. Thank you. Bye-bye.